In a single unbroken sentence spoken by a 9-year-old girl before the assembled court, Queen Camilla received the one message she had spent 2 decades building walls against. And those walls fell in public, in silence, in front of everyone who mattered. The palace did not shake because of what Charlotte said. It shook because of whose words she was carrying. What unfolded in that room was not a child's innocent remark, and it was not a coincidence of timing, and it was not the kind of moment that dissolves by morning. It was the visible surface of a mechanism that had been moving beneath the family for years, a sealed decision made long before that evening, a message entrusted to the one person no protocol could silence, and no courtier could intercept. Those who were present describe, through a documented private account, a stillness so complete that the staff along the walls stopped breathing in unison. A girl stood, a queen froze, and a ghost took her seat at the table. Before we go deeper into what this really means, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The room was not a grand one, and that is the first detail that matters. It was a private dining room, the kind the family uses when it wishes to pretend, for a few hours, that it is only a family. Candles rather than chandeliers, a long table rather than a dais, no cameras, no statements, no warnings. The evening had been arranged as a quiet gathering, the sort of internal occasion that never appears in any public record, and the seating had been planned with the usual care, the usual unspoken geometry of who may sit near whom, who must be kept apart, who is still being forgiven and who is still being measured. Charlotte had been placed, as she often was now, within sight of her father and within reach of her grandmother by marriage. That placement mattered because it put the child inside the Queen's field of vision for the entire evening. Close enough that no word she spoke could be missed. Close enough that nothing she did could be managed from a distance. The meal moved the way these meals move. Slow courses, low conversation, the careful choreography of people who have learned to be natural on command. And then, between one course and the next, in a lull that no one had scheduled and no one could have predicted, Charlotte set down her glass and spoke. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform. She said, in the clearest register a child possesses, that she had something her grandmother Diana had wanted her to say, and that she had been keeping it until she was old enough to say it properly. The sentence was not long, but it contained a name that the family has spent 20 years learning to step around, and it was spoken not by a critic, not by a biographer, not by a broadcaster, but by the direct continuation of Diana's own blood, sitting at Diana's family's table, wearing, according to a recorded internal note about the evening, a small piece of Diana's jewelry that had been passed to her privately. The Queen did not answer. That silence mattered because silence from Camilla is not emptiness, it is processing. She has survived 3 decades of public life by never answering anything in the first second it arrives. But this time the seconds stretched, and the table watched her not answer. And in the watching, something shifted that could not be shifted back. To understand what each person in that room felt, you must understand that the same sentence landed in 4 different inner worlds and fractured differently in each. For Camilla, it was the return of the one adversary she could never outmaneuver, because that adversary was no longer alive to be negotiated with, no longer present to be answered, and therefore permanently undefeated. Those close to her have described, through a documented private account, that she has never resented the public's devotion to Diana. She has resented only its permanence, the way it renews itself in every generation like a tide that no shoreline arrangement can hold back. And now the tide had a face, and the face was a 9-year-old girl who looked at her across the table with the unguarded directness that only children and queens are permitted. For William, seated near enough to intervene and choosing not to, it was something far more complicated than surprise. It was recognition. He had been there, in a sense, before any of them, a boy who had once carried his mother's confidences and felt their weight long before he understood their meaning. Watching his daughter do the same thing, in the same kind of room, at the same kind of table, he reportedly felt the evening double back on itself, 2 generations folding into one moment. That mattered because his stillness was not neutrality. His stillness was permission. Everyone at that table understood what it meant that the future king did not reach for his daughter's hand to stop her. For Catherine, it was the mathematics of motherhood performed at high speed. A daughter who had clearly been preparing this, who had not been coached, who had chosen her moment with a precision that was unmistakably deliberate. According to a family memorandum later preserved, Catherine's reaction was not shock, but a fierce, quiet pride held under tight control. The pride of a mother watching her child carry something heavy and set it down exactly where she intended. She did not speak. She did not need to. Her stillness matched her husband's, and together their stillness formed a kind of second sentence beneath Charlotte's first. And for the king, it was grief wearing the mask of duty. He sat at the head of his own table, in his own house. In the reign he had waited 70 years to begin, and he heard his late former wife's name arrive in the voice of his granddaughter, and those present say he looked, for a moment, not like a monarch but like a man being visited. His role in that room was the fading center, the figure around whom everything had once revolved, and who now discovered that the gravitational field had quietly reorganized itself while he was attending to statecraft. He did not defend his wife. He did not redirect his granddaughter. He folded his napkin, slowly, and that small mechanical gesture said everything a head of the family can say when there is nothing correct left to say. But the moment did not begin in that dining room. To understand why this carried such force, the story must return to an earlier, smaller room months before, where the mechanism was first set in motion. It began, according to a documented private account, with an afternoon that had no official shape. Charlotte had been spending time with the part of her heritage that does not appear in court circulars, the Spencer side, the memory of a grandmother she never met, but has never not known. There was, reportedly, an occasion, quiet and unlogged, when she was shown things that belonged to Diana. Letters, a notebook, small personal objects that had been kept not in a museum but in the family way, wrapped and stored and handed down with instructions rather than exhibitions. Among them was a message. Not a formal document, not anything notarized or witnessed, but a sentiment Diana had expressed in her own hand, in her own idiom, about the family she knew she would one day leave behind and the people she knew would one day have to live inside it. Its content, as preserved in a recorded internal note, was not an attack. That is crucial to understand. It was not a weapon. It was a blessing with a spine in it. A wish that her grandchildren would grow up unafraid of the truth, and a hope that those who came after her would be treated with a fairness she herself had not always received. Charlotte had asked what it meant. She had been told plainly, in the way her parents tell her things plainly, that some words belong to you until you are ready to give them away. She decided on her own that she was ready. That decision mattered because it inverted the entire machinery of palace communication. Every message the institution sends is drafted, weighed, softened, timed, and routed through offices whose whole purpose is to prevent exactly this. A true sentence arriving unscheduled. Charlotte had bypassed, in one afternoon of private resolve, 40 years of communication strategy. No courtier had seen the message. No secretary had logged it. The most protected sentence in the building was the one nobody knew existed, and there was an object at the center of it, as there so often is in this family's unwritten history. The jewelry she wore that evening, small, old, unmistakable to anyone who knew its provenance, was not decoration, it was credentials. It was the physical proof, worn openly, that what she carried had been handed to her through the bloodline, and not through the briefing room. When Camilla saw it, those present say, she understood the architecture of the moment before she understood its words. The Queen recognized the piece. She had seen it in photographs from before her time, photographs the whole world has seen. And the recognition arrived in her face, before her composure could get there first. Which brings the story back to the table, and to what happened after the silence had done its work. The confrontation that followed was not loud, and it was not immediate, and it was not, in any ordinary sense, an argument. When the meal ended, the adults dispersed the way the family disperses when something has cracked slowly, in pairs, along corridors that suddenly seemed longer than they had that afternoon, And then there came a moment, described in a documented private account, when Camilla and Charlotte were briefly, accidentally, alone except for the presence that always hovers at the edge of royal rooms, a lady-in-waiting at a careful distance, close enough to assist, far enough to deny. The Queen looked at the child. The child looked at the Queen. There was no script now, no audience worth the name, no protocol covering this exact configuration of grandmother by marriage and granddaughter by blood. Camilla spoke first, not as a queen. She asked, simply, whether Charlotte had been wanting to say that for a long time. Charlotte said yes. There was a pause that those who know the Queen would describe as uncharacteristic, because Camilla's gift has always been the ready, warm, deflecting remark, the laugh that moves a room along. No remark came. And then, according to the recorded account of that corridor, the Queen said the thing that turned a tense evening into a historic one. She said, quietly, that the little girl's grandmother would have been proud of her, and that she deserved to be spoken of, and that Camilla had never once asked the family to forget her. It was an admission, though it was not phrased as one. It was an admission that the absence of Diana's name from that family's tables had never been natural, never been healing, never been anything but an arrangement. And it was spoken to the one member of the family, young enough to receive it without defensiveness, and important enough to carry it without fear. Charlotte, with the terrible mercy of children, simply nodded and said that she knew. 2 words: the weight of a generation. But a private admission, however seismic, does not stay private inside an institution. It enters the machinery, and the machinery had already begun to move. In the days that followed, the shift revealed itself not in announcements but in objects, because that is how power actually moves in that world, through folders, schedules, seating charts, and the small physical grammar of the court. A dispatch box, in simple terms, is the red leather case in which official papers travel to a monarch for approval, and those who work around the king's boxes noticed, according to a recorded internal note, a change in what was being included and what was being quietly left out. Certain briefings about upcoming family events now carried annotations they had never carried before. The language of future planning had altered by a few degrees, the way a river alters when a single stone is moved upstream. Schedules were redrawn. An engagement that had been penciled as a solo appearance was restructured as a family one. A portrait session, long planned around a particular pairing, was reimagined around a generation instead. Each change was small. Each change was deniable. Together they formed a sentence that the court reads fluently, and the public never sees. The center of gravity has moved toward the children. And there was the matter of the cards. At formal internal dinners, place cards are not stationary, they are doctrine. Who sits beside whom is decided days in advance and reviewed at levels that would surprise the public. In the next such dinner after that evening, the seating had changed in a way that the staff registered instantly. Charlotte was no longer positioned as a child to be supervised at the edge of the arrangement. She was seated within the arrangement, at the inner table, among the principals. That mattered because placement is the court's oldest language, and the court had just said, in cardboard and calligraphy, that the truth-teller had been promoted. Camilla saw the cards before anyone. It is her household, in the domestic sense, more than anyone's, and nothing at those tables happens without passing her eyes. Those who observed her review described no objection, no adjustment, no signature tightened into a point. She looked at the new arrangement for a long moment, and then she approved it as it stood. That approval was not surrender. It was something more interesting, an alignment. The displaced insider, the woman who had spent 20 years entering rooms she was not originally invited to, had recognized in the child's message not an eviction notice but an invitation, at last, to stop defending a position and start inhabiting a family. Yet just as the machinery settled into its new configuration, a second jolt arrived, and this one came from outside the walls. Word travels out of palaces the way heat travels out of a house, not through doors, but through the fabric. Within days, fragments of the evening had reached the small circle of people who make it their business to know such things, and from them, in the usual osmosis, toward the press. But here the story took an unusual turn. The journalists who caught the scent did not run with it. Several held. One, according to accounts later exchanged among media watchers, actually contacted the palace not to threaten publication, but to ask whether the family wished the moment protected. That restraint mattered because it revealed something the court itself had not yet fully measured. The public's emotional investment in this story ran in a direction no editor wanted to be on the wrong side of. The country's attachment to Diana has never been nostalgia. It is an open account, a debt of feeling, and any framing that cast a child as a villain for honoring her grandmother would have detonated in the hands of whoever printed it. The press, which has destroyed reputations for sport, looked at this story and saw, clearly, the shape of its own public's heart. Then came the detail that made the situation irreversible. It emerged through a documented private account that reached royal correspondents that the message Charlotte had delivered was not the only one. There were others, preserved in the same way, intended for the other grandchildren, for moments they had not yet reached. Diana, 25 years gone, had not left one sentence behind. She had left a sequence of slow, posthumous conversations scheduled to unfold across decades, timed to arrive as each child came of age. The court understood at once what this meant. The evening at the dinner table had not been the crisis. It had been the first movement of a long composition. And there would be more evenings, more messages, more moments when the past would stand up at the table and speak through the young. No strategy could prevent it because the strategy's target was memory itself, and memory had outflanked them by the simplest conceivable method. It had been handed to children, as love, as inheritance, as homework for the heart. In the middle of this realization came the quietest and most important scene of all, and it involved only two people and no titles. It happened, according to a family memorandum later preserved, in the way these things happen, not scheduled, not minuted, in the ordinary corridor of a working house. Camilla and William, stepmother and stepson. The two people for whom Diana's memory had always been the most complicated object in the family. The woman who inherited the position Diana never reached, and the man who inherited everything else, including the grief. There were no witnesses close enough to quote, and what is known comes from accounts each later gave to people they trust, accounts that converge on the same shape. There was no throne room, no desk, no agenda. Just two people who had known each other since one of them was a boy, standing still in a hallway because something needed to be said, and both of them had finally run out of reasons not to say it. William spoke of his mother not as a symbol but as a person, the feel of her, the sound of her laugh down a telephone line, the way she had made palaces feel briefly like homes. And he said, in essence, that Charlotte was not a message sent against anyone. She was a message sent forward. His daughter had not been armed. She had been trusted, and there is a difference. And the difference was the whole of it. Camilla listened. That in itself was noted by those who know her rhythms, because she is a talker by instinct, a smoother of silences. This time she let the silence stand until it was finished. And then she said the thing that 20 years of shared family life had been slowly building toward. That she had never wanted to replace anyone, only to belong somewhere, and that she was not afraid of the child's honesty, because honesty had never once, in all those years, come to her from that family without eventually doing it good. William, those accounts say, nodded, and answered with the plainness that is his private register and rarely his public one, that his mother would have wanted exactly this. A family where nothing true had to be whispered. Two humans, no crowns in the corridor. And in that exchange, the last structural tension of the old arrangement quietly unloaded, the way a bridge settles when its final stress is released. Then the public found out, or found out enough, and the country responded the way it responds only a few times in a generation. The rapid cuts begin here, because public feeling does not move in slow motion. Within hours of the first careful, respectful reporting, the story had traveled further than any official statement could have carried it. Crowds gathered at the palace gates, not protesting, not celebrating, simply gathering, the way people gather at sites where something meaningful has occurred. leaving flowers not for the dead this time but for the living, for a child who had done what 1,000,000 adults had never managed. The gates, which have seen grief and rage and jubilation, saw something rarer, tenderness with an edge of vindication in it. One woman, standing near the railings, was captured by a broadcaster's microphone saying, through tears, that she had waited 25 years to hear that the little boys were all right. Now the little girl had told her, and she could stop waiting. The quote traveled around the world within the day, because it said, in civilian language, what the entire moment meant. The public had never stopped holding that family's unfinished business. And at last, someone inside the family had acknowledged the account was still open. The front pages the next morning were a study in rare unanimity. Papers that had spent decades on opposite sides of every royal question ran versions of the same image: Charlotte, small and composed, beside a headline that needed no cleverness, because the facts were already eloquent. One simply read, "She remembers her." Another, in type usually reserved for wars and elections, the message arrived. A broadcaster, opening the flagship evening program, framed it in a single line that was repeated and clipped and shared for weeks. That night, the past did not interrupt the present. It was finally, formally introduced to it. The montage had its own triads: flowers at the gates, candles in windows, ribbons on the railings. Old footage replayed, new footage captured, a quarter century compressed into a weekend. And through it all, from the palace itself, the loudest instrument in its orchestra, nothing. No denial, no correction, no carefully worded distancing. The institution that answers everything answered nothing. And the country, trained by long experience, understood that the nothing was a confirmation warmer than any words. That silence mattered because it was the final signature on the power shift. The machinery had moved, the cards had changed, the boxes carried new annotations, and now the outward face of the crown declined to push back. In the grammar of that world, the refusal to deny is the closest thing to an embrace. And so the story arrives at its verdict, which is not a verdict about scandal, because this was never a scandal. It was a correction, delivered late, through the only channel that could not be intercepted. Consider what each figure gave, and what each figure received. Diana gave the message, sealed a generation early, aimed at a future she could not see but clearly trusted. Charlotte gave the delivery, gave honesty without cruelty, memory without accusation, a child's unbearable clarity in a room full of adult arrangements. William gave permission, standing aside so the truth could walk past him unescorted. Catherine gave the foundation, the years of plain answers that made a 9-year-old brave enough to carry so heavy a sentence. The king gave silence, and in his silence, a kind of blessing. And Camilla gave grace, the grace of a woman who looked at the ghost she had lived beside for 20 years. And at last, in front of everyone, chose not to flinch. The court will absorb this, because courts absorb everything. The schedules will keep their new annotations. The seating charts will keep their new geometry. And somewhere in a drawer or a box, wrapped and waiting, the other messages rest, timed for children not yet ready, ensuring that this story does not end here, that it resumes, gently and irresistibly, every time another grandchild comes of age. The monarchy has survived wars, abdications, and the invention of the television camera. What it could not survive was never going to be any of those things. It was always going to be this: a child, a candlelit table, an old piece of jewelry, and a sentence carried faithfully across 25 years to arrive exactly where it was always addressed. No cameras, no statements, no warnings, just a family at last saying the name out loud. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next.